So I guess to introduce myself, my name is Holly Hepburn. I am the training coordinator at the Asylum Support Appeals Project. So for those of you who might not know who we are, ASAP are an independent charity that works to reduce destitution amongst asylum seekers by protecting their legal rights to food and shelter. So we work in a few ways, but we work predominantly at the appeals stage at the Asylum Support Tribunal in East London. So there we give free legal advice and representation to asylum seekers and refused asylum seekers who are appealing a refusal or discontinuation of their asylum support. We do take referrals for this service, which you can find information about on our website. We also run an advice line 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesdays and Fridays from 2 till 4, which is a really useful resource if you have any questions about asylum support or you are assisting someone with an asylum support appeal. We also do a range of training for the sector, so through webinars, but I guess what might also be useful for the people on this particular session is our e-learning modules. So they cover a range of asylum support issues and are free and available for people to complete in their own time. So they cover a kind of range of different issues relating to asylum support. Just also want to briefly mention ASAN, which is a Google group that we run. It's sort of around, I think, over nearly 2,000 asylum support professionals and volunteers. So that's people working for law firms, some government bodies such as the NHS, and it's a really useful resource for asking questions and keeping up to date with information. There'll be hyperlinks to all of these informations that I'm talking about at the end of the session. So I'm aware that probably people on this call, there'll be a sort of real mix of knowledge and understanding of asylum support. But I suppose this is a sort of real introduction to asylum support. It aims to provide you with an overview of what the asylum support system is, what support looks like, who is entitled to it, and I suppose the challenges people face when they are trying to access support through the Home Office and through the asylum support system more generally. I'm not going to go into practical advice on how to complete asylum support applications, but if that is something that your organisation does and you're looking for more support with this, then please do look at our training tab on our website for more information. So I suppose just to begin, I just wanted to outline some key terms that I'm going to use throughout this little training session. These terms are really important for kind of understanding someone's eligibility for Home Office support. So we'll come back to use these as we go through the asylum support system. Oh, sorry. It's just worth noting as well that due to the Illegal Migration Act, it's likely that much of this system might disappear, with people being unable to kind of claim asylum in the way they generally have been able to this point. We don't really know what the implications on asylum support will be, but when we do know, that's something we'll be doing a briefing about and to try and share some information on. Also worth noting as well, just the sector is trying to move away from using sort of terms such as refused or failed asylum seeker and use more kind of inclusive, kinder language. But these terms do have, their legal definitions, and they're important when talking about asylum support law. Because it relates to someone's entitlement. So it's tricky to avoid using them. So I will be using them in this session, but it's just a flag that, that language is something that the sector generally is kind of trying to move away from. So asylum can be claimed at a port of entry, so an airport, or at the asylum screening unit in Croydon, and in some cases, regional intake units across the UK. So initial screening data would be taken, so this would be biometric data, and once someone's claim has been registered, an asylum seeker would be called for an substantive interview a few months later. They would then wait on a decision for their application. When a positive decision has been made on the application, that person would be seen as a refugee for asylum support purposes. If the Home Office refuses someone's initial claim for asylum, that person will have an automatic right of appeal. There's a 14-day period for someone to appeal to the first-tier tribunal, and within that 14-day period, that person continues to be considered as an asylum seeker for support purposes. If your appeal at the first tier tribunal is refused, that person could look to apply for permission to make an application to the upper tier tribunal. If the upper tier tribunal refuses permission or allows permission, but that person loses their case, that is when someone would become appeal rights exhausted. And it's just important to kind of understand that, I guess, pathway that someone might go through when they're going through the asylum system, because that has implications for what support they then end up being entitled to. The only way to kind of challenge a refusal of permission for the upper tier tribunal would be through a judicial review. But yeah, for the purposes of asylum support, that person would be appeal rights exhausted at that stage. So I suppose generally kind of what is asylum support? And I suppose in the most basic terms I can put it, if you have claimed asylum and you do not have anywhere to live, or you have somewhere to live, but perhaps not the money to support yourself, you may be able to get asylum support. And I'll go on to kind of outline what those various forms of support are in a moment. So this support is provided by the Home Office, and depending on your circumstances, can include housing and or kind of basic living expenses, so money. It's important to note as well, and I'll come on to this in a little bit, but that asylum support is generally only offered whilst your claim for asylum is being considered. There are some exceptions to this, which I'll cover, but generally when someone's claim is being considered is when they would be eligible for asylum support. The legislation that governs this, and without trying to get too legal, even though we are a kind of legal organisation, are sections 98, 95 and section 4 of the 1999 Immigration Act. So this legislation states that people who claim asylum in the UK should be provided accommodation to prevent them from becoming homeless. So this is instead of providing housing through local authorities or housing associations, but the Home Office has outsourced accommodation provision to private providers, which I'm sure many of you know. You might also hear this being called NAS support, as well as asylum support, and that's kind of after the department that the Home Office used to kind of provide support in the past. So it was in 1999 that this kind of current system came in, and Part 6 of the Act, which allowed. Yeah. So essentially, Part 6 of that Act transferred responsibility for support of all asylum seekers onto the National Asylum Support Service. It's worth mentioning here as well that asylum support advice is not regulated in the way that immigration and asylum law is. That type of laws or advice is governed by OISC. So to give advice on various parts of the asylum system or advice on someone's asylum claim, you would need to be OISC accredited. That doesn't apply to asylum support. Just worth noting there, because I think that's a point that people are sometimes unsure about. I suppose whilst we're talking about what asylum support is as well, it's just worth mentioning that, you know, most asylum seekers are largely barred from working. If they don't receive a decision on their initial asylum claim for over 12 months and they do a job on the shortage occupation list, they can apply for permission to work. And that number is increasing for reasons which I'll come on to. But in general, if people can't be supported by their family members and they cannot work, they would generally need to access asylum support. So the AASC and the AIR contracts are sort of the two main contracts that the Home Office have with private contractors relating to asylum support. So under the asylum, it's a tongue twister, Asylum Accommodation and Support Services contract, which is the AASC one, there are sort of 7 asylum accommodation and support contracts throughout the UK. So names which you'll hear will be Clear Springs, Ready Homes, Mears, and Circle as well. So the stated aim of the contract is to essentially meet the accommodation and essential living needs of eligible asylum seekers and provide a range of services, including transport services. The other contract which is the AIR contract, governs the relationship between the Home Office and its contracted advice provider. So this is Migrant Help. So they're a national charity. They were contracted by Home Office, I think, initially in 2014 to provide various services during the asylum and asylum support process. So the head office is in Dover, but it does also have accommodation. It has offices and initial accommodation centres throughout the UK as well. So I think it was 2019 as well, where a new 10-year contract was signed by the Home Office. So Migrant Help do have the responsibility of providing a sort of wide range of services, and they're quite often the kind of the point of contact for people when they need to contact Home Office about a specific issue. So the main way people can get in touch with Migrant Help is either through the phone or also, I think, through their online portal system. We have had reports of people it being very difficult to get through to Migrant Help on the phone, and I'm aware that a lot of sort of third sector organisations will assist people they're working with to contact Migrant Help. So that might be through email or through raising issues on their online portal. Migrant Help also supports people who are looking to apply for asylum support and making applications. So they can either call or, like I said, raise it online that they wish to apply for asylum support, and Migrant Help should assist them with that application. This is also something that I know a lot of third sector organisations are doing as well. Okay, so I've put on here just a sort of simple flowchart which kind of outlines the basics of this asylum support system in the UK. It's not very high tech or aesthetically pleasing, but I think it does the job. And I think what's clear from this flowchart is that destitution is a prerequisite for any form of asylum support. I'll come on to touch on that in a little moment because it is a really important part of understanding asylum support. So, as is clear from this flowchart here, right, what stage someone is at in the asylum support, in the asylum process, will impact what type of asylum support they are eligible for. So I'm going to go through these just in a little bit more detail because they all vary a little bit. So briefly, Section 98 is initial temporary accommodation. So this is generally offered to someone when they claim asylum at a port of entry or when they attend their screening interview. So this is emergency accommodation, initial accommodation. And this is generally support accommodation is given in hotels. Section 95, which is traditionally called dispersal accommodation, is for people who are waiting a decision on their asylum claim or a decision on an in-time appeal against a refusal of their asylum claim. Section 4 is for those who are appeal rights exhausted but meet one of the other eligibility criteria, which I will outline a little bit. The most common reason people tend to go on to Section 4 would be if they have become appeal rights exhausted and they then re-engage with the further submissions process. But there are other criteria which people may meet, which make them eligible. I put Schedule 10 here. I mean, this type of support is outside of the the typical asylum support system. But you may see people that you're working with, service users, clients that are on Schedule 10 or may go on to access Schedule 10. But I guess simply this is for those who are on immigration bail, but they don't necessarily fit the criteria of Section 95 and Section 4. So I touched on Section 98 there. So like I said, this is supposed to be temporary accommodation, emergency support for people who are seeking asylum and who are waiting normally for a decision on their Section 95 application. So what would normally happen is someone would access Section 98, and whilst if they're granted Section 98, they would then make a Section 95 application. whilst that's pending, given there's no change to their circumstances, they should continue to be on Section 98. So as I mentioned, it's often called initial accommodation and is usually in the form of sort of full board at a home office, hostel, hotel, or accommodation centre. So in some places in the UK, it's self-catering, but that's kind of rare. In those circumstances, people living there would be given cash if it's not full board. But generally, people receive no financial support on Section 98 and it's full board, so meals are given in the hotel or accommodation centre or wherever it is that person is living. So what we're certainly seeing is that people are staying in Section 98 accommodation for a lot longer than they have been in the past. I know that previously, I think Home Office had advised after about 3 to 4 weeks, people should be expecting to be dispersed. But obviously what we're seeing at the moment is that people are in hotels for much longer periods of that. And often will actually stay in the hotel, even if they get granted Section 95. We've often, what we've heard as well from those in the sector is that many people are kind of reporting that there's delays in getting screening interviews, which in turn kind of leads to delays in people being able to access accommodation. For people who are already in the UK and go on to claim asylum, they'll generally have to wait until their asylum application is recorded and they've been screened before they can access Section 98. There are exceptions to this though. If someone is particularly vulnerable, I would suggest definitely doing some advocacy to try and get Section 98 accommodation access before they're screened, but it can be very tricky. So while someone is in Section 98 accommodation, or they may not be, they may be supported by a friend, they would typically make an application for Section 95 support. So this would be, should be granted or refused. It can vary between weeks or sometimes months after being in Section 98 accommodation or making the application. So this accommodation can be given through accommodation only. Accommodation and financial support or financial support only. So this means for those who have somewhere to live, but perhaps no means to meet their essential living needs, they could apply for financial support only. This tends to typically be when someone can live with a friend, for example, but the friend isn't in a financial position to support them. They can ask to just be given financial support only. Quite a high threshold of evidence, it's worth noting, is required from that person that's providing accommodation to kind of show why they can't provide that financial support, but it's certainly an option for people in this circumstance. So if someone is granted Section 95 and is sent to dispersal accommodation, so that would be normally outside London and the southeast to one of the dispersal areas in the UK. If they're in self-enclosed accommodation, so like a flat, they would receive £49.18 per week, and that's for each person. So if there was a dependent on the asylum claim, so a child or a partner, each person would get £49.18. If the person is accommodated in Section 95 in a hotel, which we are seeing because of the kind of lack of available accommodation, they would only receive £8.86 per week because they're provided with food, which is obviously quite a low rate. And I know that it's particularly tough for people that spend a long time in hotels on Section 95. Just worth noting here as well that there are some additional payments available to people on Section 95. So this would be £3 for pregnant mothers per week and £5 for babies under 1. There's also a one-off maternity payment that people can access. You can apply through Migrant Help, and that's £300. An important thing to note here is that accommodation under Section 95 is offered on a no-choice basis. So that essentially means that people who are granted Section 95 do not have a say on where they live in the UK. I thought it was useful here to maybe touch on some of the factors that the Home Office need to consider if someone makes a request to stay in a particular area. So I suppose the first thing, I guess I should just caveat that first by saying generally the threshold to be accommodated in a specific area is very high, but there are factors that should be considered. And the Home Office need to show that they've considered them if they're raised on an application. So I guess the first thing that comes up a lot is medical. So are there any medical needs that will affect someone's dispersal? Generally, the Home Office position is that care and treatment for most medical conditions are available in all parts of the UK, and that transfer responsibility for managing that person's care can be put with a different NHS organisation. But it is worth flagging if there are specific medical issues that person has that would be relevant to their dispersal, or even the type of accommodation that they is appropriate for them to stay in. Late stage pregnancy is relevant here, though. I think it's if someone is within the 6-week period of giving birth, they shouldn't be dispersed to another area as well. Kind of touching on, similar to kind of medical considerations, there's also specialist support. So there's specifically 2 charities. One is the Helen Bamber Foundation and Freedom from Torture. Both of those organisations are for people who have experienced torture and have kind of active trauma, and they give quite intense level of care. The Home Office position on this is that if someone is a patient at either of these centres, they need to be accommodated in a place which their care can continue. So Freedom from Torture have different offices. I know Helen Bamber work in London, and if someone is getting active care from the Helen Bamber Foundation, they should be able to stay in the area to allow them to finish with that care. It's also education as well. If kids are of school age and are going through exams, a request should be made that they're not dispersed from that area to allow them to complete their exams. Also, if a child is receiving is at a school which is particularly tailored to their learning needs, so a specialist school, and that is not available in a different area of the UK, then the Home Office should consider letting them remain in that local area. Okay, so Section 4 support. So this is support that is available for failed asylum seekers, the term which I don't like to use, but is the terminology that the Home Office do. So someone becomes appeal rights exhausted, as I mentioned earlier, when their claim is refused and all their appeal rights have been exhausted. So Section 4 support is available to failed asylum seekers in a particular set of circumstances. It's generally intended to be sort of temporary support while someone is unable to return home. Yeah, so it's intended to be sort of temporary support while someone is unable to return home for whatever reason that may be. So unlike Section 95, it's given as a package of accommodation and financial support. So you can't just apply for one aspect. You also cannot withdraw cash from your Aspen card, which is a big difference. The rates are the same, and the no choice accommodation and the considerations, which I outlined for Section 95, are the same as well. Similarly to Section 95, Section 4 accommodation historically has been self-enclosed accommodation in a dispersal area, but there do seem to be large amounts of people now in hotels on Section 4 and also accommodation centres. But essentially, to be eligible for Section 4 support, someone will need to show that 1, they are a failed asylum seeker, 2, they are destitute, and 3, that they meet one of the criteria. So the first would be that they're taking all steps to leave the UK. So generally this would be people who have accessed the voluntary return scheme. Secondly, would be that they are unable to leave the UK because they're physically or medically unable to travel. This criteria is a very high threshold and essentially is for people who couldn't physically board a plane, or it would be medically advised that they should not board a plane. It's not, I think the kind of common misconception is that sometimes this criteria is for people who are quite unwell. But unfortunately, unless you have quite strong medical advice that explains why this person shouldn't travel, it's quite a tricky criteria to get granted on. One is that you have been granted permission to proceed with a judicial review. And the last one is that provision of Section 4 support is necessary to avoid breaching your human rights. So I would say this is the most common criteria that people become eligible for Section 4 on. It's the kind of widest criteria. And the most common reason people would become eligible under this criteria is that they've kind of re-engaged with the immigration system. So they have some sort of outstanding immigration application and they're in a failed asylum seeker. We have quite a lot of resources as well on the kind of differences between these types of support, and I saw that it was very handily put in the chat for people to see as well, because I know this is a lot of information. But I guess simply the kind of difference between Section 95 and Section 4 is Section 95, you can get subsistence only, so just money. On Section 4, you don't receive cash, whereas on Section 95, you do. And with Section 95, you can get that kind of interim support pending a decision. So that comes from Section 98 for people that are failed asylum seekers and need to apply for Section 4. There's kind of that interim support that exists. For Section 95 doesn't. So you can't access Section 98 once you become appeal rights exhausted. I see there's a couple of questions, but I think I'm just going to come back to those at the end if that's okay. I'm just cautious of time, and then we can definitely come back to those. I just wanted to mention Schedule 10 again, just briefly, because it's kind of come up a lot more recently in the last little while with kind of large numbers of people who have withdrawn asylum claims. So that might be implicitly or explicitly. So at that point, they're no longer an asylum seeker for support purposes. And if they do re-engage with the immigration system, so make a further application, it's likely that they would be eligible for Schedule 10. It's because they would be subject to immigration bail most likely, but they wouldn't be an asylum seeker or a refused asylum seeker for support purposes. I don't have loads of time to go into Schedule 10 today, but we do have a fact sheet on it on our website. But I wanted to raise it kind of outside of the typical, asylum support that we might talk about. I also mentioned destitution, and I suppose it's important just to touch on kind of what that means within asylum support, as it's a prerequisite for kind of all types of asylum support. So the Home Office apply what they call the destitution test. So this is like an either-or test. So a person can be destitute if they are without means, if they're without accommodation or means to meet their essential living needs. So it's not necessary for someone to be street homeless to be found destitute. For example, someone might have a place where they can stay, as I mentioned earlier, but no means of feeding themselves or providing for themselves financially. If someone is applying for Section 98, the prerequisite is that they are destitute on the day, so they will have to give some evidence as to why they require Section 98 accommodation at the point of application. For Section 4 and for Section 95, the test is 14 days. So they might be destitute on the day of application, or they might be likely to be destitute within the next 14 days. So when someone is making an application for Section 4 or Section 95, it will be appropriate for them to provide evidence. So this would be evidence of perhaps where they have stayed since they lived in the UK, why they need accommodation, why the support that they've had available to them so far isn't anymore. And the thresholds of evidence can be kind of quite a bit higher for those who've been in the UK for a long time and maybe not been on asylum support, because there will be a sort of expectation from Home Office that they've been able to support themselves kind of up to this point. So they will need to show why they can no longer do that. As I mentioned as well, it's not a prerequisite for someone to be street homeless to access asylum support. So I suppose some questions that are useful to consider. So it's Regulation 8, I think, off the top of my head, of the asylum support regulations, which kind of set out what adequate accommodation is. But some questions that might be useful to kind of ask someone if you're kind of trying to ascertain if they would be likely to meet that test is, is it reasonable for them to stay there? Can they afford the rent? Can they access the accommodation? Can they live there with their dependents? Is it safe for them? Is there a risk of domestic abuse? And if the answer to some of these questions is no, it's likely that that accommodation isn't adequate. And you would be asking the Home Office to find them destitute on that basis. I touched on this briefly earlier, but I think it's maybe just worth mentioning again because it's something we're seeing a lot come through our advice line and on ASAN is the sort of impact of working on asylum support and what it means for someone if they do start to have an income. I think especially given, as I mentioned, the destitution is a prerequisite for asylum support. It's like a really big area, and I did a whole 2 hours on it a couple of months ago, so I won't be able to do this kind of topic the justice it deserves. But we do have a briefing coming out, if it's not out already, I think maybe in the sort of coming months on the effect of income and asylum support, because it is really important for people and to understand what might happen to their asylum support if they start earning. I suppose generally, essentially, if someone begins to earn kind of more than the subsistence amount of asylum support, that the Home Office may consider reducing their payments if they're on Section 95, or if they earn above what the Home Office would class to be the destitution threshold, then their support might stop. But it's a really complex area, and yeah, I won't have too much time to go into it now. But I think the main thing is if you are working with people who are on asylum support and do have an income, in order for them to kind of protect themselves, they should be disclosing that income to Home Office so the Home Office can kind of make an assessment on their entitlements. It is a condition of asylum support that any change in circumstances gets reported, and if it isn't, it can often lead to their support ending entirely under breach of conditions. But if this is an issue with someone you're working with as well, we do have our advice line that you can call and give a bit more kind of specific case advice about it. Yeah, because all of the kind of various scenarios are complex and very fact specific. So yeah, specific advice from us might help. I also wanted to mention the Asylum Support Tribunal as well. I've outlined kind of what asylum support looks like and who might be eligible for support. But it's worth mentioning the tribunal because often someone might be refused support or have their support discontinued incorrectly, and often they will have a right of appeal to the Asylum Support Tribunal about that decision. So normally if someone wants to make an appeal on either a discontinuation or a refusal of their asylum support, they should be informed in the letter that they have a right of appeal. Sometimes there are cases where there definitely should be a right of appeal and there isn't. So if you think that might be the case, we do have an advice line on that as well, and someone should take advice on whether that decision actually is appealable. But for appealable decisions, this normally needs to be made within 3 days and lodged with the tribunal. The tribunal would then give the person a directions notice, which would go into a bit of detail about what they want to know more about. And that appeal would be heard normally, typically face to face at the Asylum Support Tribunal in East London. Again, a massive area that I probably don't have time to go into now, but there's loads of information about it on our website. And I suppose one point from me is, we're seeing that a lot of people sometimes aren't appealing refusals or discons on their support when they often should. So it's just to really encourage people to try and get advice from an organisation in their area, which would be able to kind of look at this with them, maybe call us, whatever it may be, so that people can, try and potentially access support that they're entitled to. Just cautious of time, so I probably won't touch on this too much, but just kind of mentioning briefly people outside the asylum support system. So unaccompanied asylum seeking children, and they're generally supported by the local authority. There may also be people in the asylum system supported by social services under the CARE Act or the relevant legislation in devolved nations. And it's also worth mentioning as well that asylum seekers with dependent children under the age of 18 who have been refused asylum will continue to be eligible for asylum support, even though their claim has been fully decided. And this is dependent on the child being born or part of that claim before it was refused. It's a bit of the Act called Section 94.5. So you might often see families that don't actually have an active application but are still on asylum support. Just wanted to put here as well, other sources of help. We've got a section on our website which is probably by no means a comprehensive list of everybody that's doing amazing work relating to asylum support, but it does have a kind of regional breakdown of organisations that we know to be doing asylum support work. So if you're working with someone that needs some advice, then hopefully one of those organisations listed on our website might be able to help. I know that people are like really busy and capacity is crazy. So I'm not sure what people are able to do, but it's a really good resource to kind of be able to point people towards. I'm cautious of time as well, so I'm going to just leave this up here but move on to the next slide. It's just a note of kind of some of the things that people in the asylum support system might be entitled to, despite the fact they're NRPF. I suppose if I can kind of just briefly, I'm just thinking what's the most important bit to touch on here. Yeah, so the kind of early education and childcare obviously isn't public fund for immigration purposes. So young children in asylum seeking families should be able to access that. I think there's restrictions depending on age, so it's best to kind of look at what's going on in the country that you're from, whether it's Scotland, Northern Ireland. But yeah, I'm just going to whiz past this slide because I just think the next one is really important, and I want to have some time for questions as well. So could be here for a while talking about the challenges, but I suppose to kind of sum up some of the main ones that people trying to access asylum support or people in the asylum support system might face. So what we've seen a lot is that people are experiencing quite long delays in accessing or getting decisions on asylum support applications. So often caseworkers have had to reach out to community care solicitors to send PAPs. We've heard of decision letters going to incorrect addresses, people not receiving those decisions. And at the end of that is someone often that, really needs support and experiences really long delays in being able to access support that very often they're entitled to. A lot of people are waiting a really long time for decisions on their asylum claims as well. So that can lead to being on support for quite a long time. People in the asylum support system report kind of quite struggles with trying to access, the food that they need with the money that they're given on asylum support. Often, asylum support accommodation is in quite remote areas, and quite often where there isn't actually access to services that can support them. A big issue that we're seeing as well is people, as I mentioned, staying in initial accommodation for really long periods of time. So that's hotels and in some cases accommodation centres. Families are supposed to be priority for dispersal out of hotels, but many report really long wait times for dispersal. And I know that it's becoming increasingly damaging for people's physical and mental health, their well-being, and the kind of social isolation that living in that type of accommodation can bring. And again, someone being in a hotel for a really long period of time, and if they're able to, embed themselves in the community and get support and access services, they're then dispersed to a different area where they don't have that support that they've maybe built up. And that in itself can cause issues. So, whether someone's in a hotel for a long time and then when they get dispersed. I know that many people seeking asylum have also reported difficulty in accessing some healthcare whilst in hotels, and in some cases being able to access relevant support for their children and education. I also just wanted to note here as well, because I had to kind of skim past it for a time earlier, but just whilst I'm mentioning kind of access to healthcare, I know that Doctors of the World have some really good resources for those struggling to access GP services, and have created like GP access cards for various for the NHS, to kind of encourage active GP registration. So just worth mentioning that as well. And I also just want to touch on accommodation centres. I know it's been a massive point of focus, like in the media recently, and for those working in the sector, especially with recently Vivi Stockholm. But I know that the sector has, big concerns around, the safety and the accommodation centres, and whether, the accommodation centres, meet even the minimum legal standards for asylum accommodation. I know there was a case, I think in June 2021, off the back of the fire in Napier, and the Home Office, have said they've made improvements since then. So, but I know that for the sector, there's, concerns around the type of accommodation this is and the implications it has on people's healthcare and people's health, and their access to support, legal advice. There's a concern that using accommodation centres and really remote areas kind of, will segregate and re-traumatize people, and that they are going to be continued to be used by Home Office. And as a sector, we're, trying to get Home Office to address these concerns. So just reading one of the questions here about people receiving a positive asylum decision but then not receiving the notice to quit, months or even years. Yeah, there seems to be confusion. Are there times? Yeah, so the timeframes that you've sort of outlined are correct. It's that 28 days after that person has received their positive decision. But yeah, what we're seeing is that there's actually extremely long delays to that, and it can cause issues in that person trying to go on and access local authority support. I know that in some cases, organisations are trying to do advocacy on that person's behalf to, alert Home Office that they're still in support and they wish to be given their notice to quit. But I suppose the short answer is that there's no real reason for that happening, and that there was a real backlog, and my understanding is that Home Office are kind of trying to work their way through that and clear that. But yeah, that's a kind of short answer, I suppose. Just to confirm, is there anything we can be doing to advocate for people to stay in their local area? Working with someone who was in a hotel for over 1 year and has built up a community here. Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, what might be a really useful policy for you to look at is the allocation of accommodation policy. So this is the kind of policy that the Home Office use when they are trying to make a decision as to whether someone needs to be accommodated in a certain area. So it mentions the factors that they have to consider, but unfortunately, becoming, linked in with the local community doesn't often reach that threshold. It would need to be kind of, if there was perhaps like someone had family in that local area and that was a child and there was a need for that person to be close enough to see that child, then that might be something that would take it over the threshold. But if there's a case where you're working with someone and they've been dispersed and you think that it's not appropriate looking at that allocation of accommodation policy, then you could certainly involve a community care solicitor. But unfortunately, yeah, the threshold is so high. I mean, you can put it on an application, the request. That's what I would suggest you always do. But whether Home Office consider that, it's kind of slim. I can see there's a hand up, so I'm just going to click allow to talk because there's a question from Matt. So does that work, Matt? No? Okay. I don't think that's worked. I'll just go back to the chat. Oh, I didn't mean to have your hand up. Okay. Sorry. I've accidentally put you on screen with everyone else then. Okay, let me just go back to the questions. We're supporting primary hotels who welcome many families from local IA hotels. Often families are moved so quickly by the Home Office that pupils don't have a chance to say goodbye to their school friends and teachers. They attend one day and then leave the next. Should the Home Office provide a few days' notice? Yeah, the short answer is there should be adequate notice provided. From what I can remember, it should be the Home Office have advised us, or in writing they've advised the sector it should be at least 5 days, I think. But we hear reports often that doesn't happen, which obviously is really disappointing. I think the worry would be, when people not travelling to accommodation and they're given on short notice that support ends up stopping if the Home Office record them as failure to travel, which obviously is a concern. But I think that that there should be at least 5 days notice given, and if someone doesn't travel because there has been a lack of notice, as someone working in the sector or working with that person, I would certainly, make sure that they inform Home Office of why they haven't travelled, if it's been because, the deadlines have been too short, to make sure that support doesn't stop. They should be getting 5 days notice though. I think it's 5. I'll double check that though, and maybe I can circulate the answer with the resources after I send them out after the session. But unfortunately, what you're saying, Catherine, is kind of what we're hearing happen in the sector. Let's just see if there's anything else. I can see that Migrants Organised have answered some questions, which is great. We've got 5 minutes left if there's anything that anyone else wants to talk about. I'm just having a look here at the answered questions. Yeah, I can see there was something there about right to work and the impact on support. And yeah, you're right. We're gonna try and get some guidance out on this soon because it's a really kind of complex area that people are struggling to advise on, because it's it's really embedded in the destitution test. But what's also really tricky about it is that the Home Office don't actually have any guidance on this yet. You look the assessing destitution policy, which is the guidance that the Home Office use to assess someone's destitution, doesn't actually give a lot of information around active income. So a lot of what we're kind of saying is based on what we think should happen, based on what we've kind of seen happen. Let's have a look at the chat. But yeah, there isn't actually a specific Home Office policy on this, so we're kind of Someone just said, I work with survivors of domestic abuse. Do the Home Office consider safety of victims when housing them? They definitely should. There is a specific policy on how the Home Office should support survivors of domestic abuse. We actually have a e-learning on this and a fact sheet, which might be really useful for you, Ella, because their policy does go into detail about how they should respond to the needs of survivors. So it's definitely worth taking a look at that. Yeah. So kind of in short, the asylum support system kind of is really complicated. And I know that that was a lot of information, but I hope that for people that, work with people in the asylum system, that understanding the support system a little bit better will really kind of like help you to support them and understand what they're entitled to. Like I've said as well, our advice line is open 3 times a week. And if you are working with someone and you have a question about asylum support, we can give you case-specific advice there. But what I would definitely say is if this is an area you're interested in and affects your work, that our e-learning modules are really great for kind of expanding your knowledge. And someone just asked, how can I keep on any guides you might release? Do you have a newsletter, for example? Well, when we release new briefings or trainings, or we have webinars, we post it on our Twitter, which might be a useful way to be up to date. Also, depending on the organisation that you're from, you could potentially be on ASAN. At the moment, we don't tend to have local authority staff on ASAN, but I know most of our members are sort of from voluntary organisations, community groups, third sector. So if you're on ASAN as well, you might get those updates, but if not, keeping an eye kind of on our Twitter is maybe the best way to kind of keep up to date. But we'll try and normally share it with people we think it would be useful for when it comes out. Right. Just one last question then before we finish. Work at school, we've had families in the hotel who've been here for 7 months who aren't moving. Others have been here days and moved to different accommodation. Why is this? The short answer is it's hard to know. A lot of it will come down. Well, my understanding is that quite often the size of family and when they have available accommodation. But what I would say is if the family has specific needs and living in a hotel is making it really difficult for them, they should consider maybe whether they could maybe get a community care solicitor involved. It won't be appropriate in all cases, but in some cases, if you can get a community care solicitor involved, it can maybe pat the Home Office on the dispersal. That can sometimes have some success. But the short answer is it might be family-specific needs, accommodation needs, but other times it doesn't actually, make all that sense. Oh, okay. Thanks for answering that question from Naomi. Yeah. As people aren't allowed. Yeah. They are, they're still claiming asylum and being accommodated. What the kind of IMA is likely to do for asylum support, we're kind of anticipating, but we're kind of preventing. We're not going to release kind of any guidance until we really know. We kind of have, been thinking about what's likely to happen, but at the moment, people are still accessing asylum support through the routes that I mentioned earlier. But when that changes, we'll definitely, release some guidance on that to try and support people. Yeah. No claims are being processed post-July 2023, so people are in a limbo and in asylum support. Yeah. So I suppose our expertise comes from asylum support and what we know is happening there, and nothing seems to have changed too much at the moment with regards to what people are entitled to. But yeah, as Ali mentioned, no claims are being processed, so people are kind of stuck in that middle period. I hope that was useful. I realise we've hit past. But yeah, please do get in touch with us on the advice line if you need more help with specific cases. Have a look at our resources. I think they're really useful and hopefully answer those questions you might have about asylum support or entitlements. But I suppose, that's all from me. And Thank you for listening to me ramble for an hour. But I do hope it was useful. And yeah, if you can fill in the feedback, it's very, very welcome. And I hope you all have a nice day and get a bit of sunshine wherever you are. Okay, thank you very much.